We're going to continue with the aspect of employee discipline by going through the 5 different steps that we talked about. And really, we call this due process. So the very first one is you have a verbal warning, oral reprimand, whatever that may be, and you can do that all on its own, but no matter what happens, you should always document it with a note in your own personal administrative file about that employee in case you have to come back to that at a future date. Or you can even sit down and have the verbal warning, and you can sit down and then send them an email about it. It just depends the depth and the impact you want to have. If you go into writing to the employee, it becomes more formal instead of a casual dialogue. So that said, your step 2 is about putting something in writing. The second step could be, a written warning or whatever. And then this one, I call it a written warning with consequences, but you can also call this a written reprimand to make it different than a written warning. By reprimand, you're going to identify the clarity. You have violated the following things at work. I've gone through even to the point of referring to, since we have multiple different employee groups, I would identify your organization. You have an ethical code. I would actually take the code for that one. And just so you know, we had a group of management. I had an ethics code for that. I had it for this group of staff, and this group of staff, and this group. So each one had their own specific thing. We had 5 different employee groups. So we'd have identified their different ethical codes they had, and I would quote that. I would quote a board policy. I would quote an administrative regulation. I would quote whatever, but I'm starting to identify what they did. And then also, I want to include also the consequences of that they resulted. Your failure to do this work has affected the following over here. Our audit was actually impacted for 3 different days because your reports were not in a timely fashion. This happened or this happened. You want to identify that, first of all, they're in trouble. Identify exactly what it is. You also identify specifically what they violated. You want to identify the impact it's had on the workplace, and then you want to identify your specific expectations. My expectations are, and you put them right there, that this will happen. You'll be more timely in your submittal of all your financial documents. You'll be more communicative about this. If you have problems, you'll come to me specifically. Failure to do so in the future may result into additional action, include up to and including termination. You want to sit down there and start going there. So that said, you need to sit down and say it. Okay. Reiterate your expectations. This is no longer a friendly, casual talk. This is a matter of you are placing them on warning that, boom, this could happen to you. Do not do it. Don't do it, because I will go through and follow through with additional things up to including terminating your employment from this organization. You need to change now. That's how you say it. You be pretty clear in it. Now, it depends how you're going to write this memo. Okay, normally the maximum any memo should ever be, in my opinion, is 3 pages, unless you're citing numerous different recitations from they violated 17 different procedures. But really, you want to keep it really to a 1 or 2 page document if you can, maybe 3. I had a supervisor come in and they had a 14-page reprimand. I'm not kidding. 14 pages. I mean, they must have sat down and just thought about this for a long time. We told him, knock it off, reduce it, and don't submit anything without us reviewing it. He cut it down to 11 pages and sent that. Eventually, we ended up terminating the supervisor. He didn't know how to supervise very well. But with that, make certain you're clear, concise. Nobody can decipher a 14-page document because it looks like you're throwing the book at him, and literally it almost was a book. He probably had to get some special binding for the edges of it. So by the time you're all done, make certain that you reiterate and that there's immediate expectation of change. And if you don't do it, here's going to happen. We're going to provide you to make certain help. If you need any help, you'll see the following different things. Avoid any future disciplinary actions. Anything you put in writing is always copied specifically on the bottom of the page. You want to sit down on your last page, copy to personnel file. It goes there, and that is your permanent record, and it also identifies that this is really serious. Now, if you have further trouble, and by the way, all these steps are just steps. If somebody does something heinous, if they sit down and they do something irrational. One time I had an employee, and this is one of those horror stories where somebody is walking through the tunnels underneath the building where all the pipes, electrical pipes are, and a coworker leaped out of the shadow with a pipe wrench and knocked the person over, and the person was 6 inches taller than them, and he thought the guy was going to kill him. And he had good legitimate aspects of that because of the fact he's slobbering, and the man was terminated for that single action. Guess what? We didn't do progressive discipline. We didn't go through step 1, 2, 3, 4. We went from, you're an employee and you did this, boom, you're gone, dude. We will never tolerate workplace violence. That's it. This is a matter of you want to restore them, except for the fact that they do something totally egregious, it is instant termination. You can go from here to unpaid suspension if you need to. This is a recommendation model, but it's not carved in stone that you have to follow. I must do this. You sat there and beat somebody in the head with a pipe wrench. We're going to give you a written warning this time. No, you don't do that. Unpaid suspension. It depends how long it is and severity of it. I've done before where I've talked to, in my case, I had to deal with a union. I would talk to the union and say, okay, this is egregious. We can't handle this, and I plan on suspending them. Well, how long do you plan on suspending them? I says 30 days. And the union rep comes back and says, well, if you make it 10, I'll talk to them and we'll make this stick better. Sometimes this is a matter of negotiation in a process or whatever, but by the time you're done, you can determine 3, 10, 30, or even 6 months. I personally think if you go past 30 and you want to go to 6 months, you should just terminate them right there because it's that egregious. If you're going to suspend somebody, sometimes a good financial slap in the aspect of and all of a sudden it might wake them up, because a suspension is always, this is severe. This is step 1 for your final foot out the door. Okay, so with that, have a reasonable time frame, 3 days, 10 days, whatever you want in the process, but they have to know that this is going to really be huge, because if you're suspended, next time you will be terminated. Importance of the documentation. At this point, you're in step 4. There should be an oral reprimand, and there should be some type of a record. If you sent an email or an administrative note in your file, and then the second time you did that, you refer back. If you have another oral reprimand, you should refer back to the first one on the second one. Or when you do a written reprimand or written warning, it should refer back to each one of those occasions if you have multiple ones. And then you have a written reprimand that's going to document everything previous to that. And then if you do a suspension, you need to identify all the previous times right in the record. And that way there's no mistaking it. If you pretend that you're in front of a jury and you're explaining what happens, and by the way, if you follow this process, the probability of you losing the case is pretty slim, because you're actually listening and you're also documenting things as you go. Have clear records for reference. And sometimes something may happen, and whatever in their personnel file may be there 5 years from now after they're already gone. You need to sit down and have a clear reference, because you may not be sitting in the chair, it could be somebody else. Make certain that you have a record as what's going on. Professional communication, you are not going to talk about them personally. You're going to say, if you did this, here are the actions that we looked over here. If it's a matter of some kind of substance abuse, unless you're a professional drug or alcohol counselor, keep your nose out of it. That's not your role. Unless you have that training, don't make judgments about them. Your job as a supervisor, your job as being in charge of employment law, is to deal with the reality of what's happening and trying to restore them, if you can, to the appropriate discipline that they have within the organization. And this process may do that. Explain reasons clearly and expectations for return. You're going to expect them to do well, and you may end up having to do termination. Now, when it comes down to suspension and termination, you need to always have somebody in your office that is there to keep notes as to exactly what happens, making certain that there's no miscommunication. I have had occasion where I've had a written reprimand to somebody, and I had the employee there, and I had a union steward in my office, and foolishly, I assumed they would be telling the truth, and they didn't. They lied over what was said. make certain that you bring somebody in of similar rank to yourself, maybe a step down, and their job is to park in a corner and just take notes of what happened, and they come in for discipline. If you have the employee, you say, they're here just to take notes, and they're going to be quiet, and they're going to be sworn to confidentiality. They will not be discussing this, but they're here. Let's talk. You always have a witness there to make certain that everything that happens is actually documented and that you have witnesses. There's clear communication. If the employee has questions, you answer the questions right there. If you have an issue of security, I've had security officers or police officers on standby. I've had them in the hallway in full uniform. In my case, I'm fortunate to have a police department at the college itself. You may not have that luxury, but you may have security. Think about that aspect of it. But don't go into these meetings of suspension or termination by yourself. That is foolhardy because of the fact that people under stress may not remember what was happening. They may misinterpret stuff, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, because they're stressed in the process. Be sensitive, be respectful. You don't need to be that one that sat there and says, you, that is not what you should be doing. You should say, here's the actions we're concerned about, and that's why we're releasing you from employment. This is a tough thing. Now, by the way, these people that sit down there and they do this kind of stuff, you're terminated, and they send you a text. Oh my gosh, they should never be in leadership, in my opinion. If you can't look somebody in the eye and tell them that here is the behavior that we cannot tolerate as an organization, you should not be considered to be a leader in an organization. I stand by that no matter what happens. If you decide that you're going to lead, you need to have enough backbone to look somebody in the eye and say, you didn't do the following things over here, and here is exactly what we expected to have happen. We warned you, and this is the consequence of your actions. Put it on them. It is not you to sit down there and carry their burden, whatever it may be, but conduct it. But no matter what, you conduct it in a professional manner. You treat them with dignity and respect. You don't embarrass them in front of other people. You do this privately after the meeting and termination. You try to have a private exit out of the building that you're in. You don't want to sit down and make this a production, an embarrassment for them. Make certain you have the witness. That way you have a protection for all. Here are the 5 steps. Verbal warning, whichever way you want to do it, you can document it. Okay, a written warning in writing that you're referring back to the verbal warning in it. A written reprimand, which is a stronger, different type of aspect of it. A suspension, and then finally a termination. These are the 5 steps. You can vary them according to the situation. You may go longer because this may take over 3 years, or it could be in 6 months. Depends upon the progression, but you want to make certain that you follow good due process and that you listen to people as you go, and really make certain you're focusing on actions rather than a person. Take care.